What's up, my wizards? It's Dev from the place with the decks, plural today, it turns out. We got two of them for you, both based around Sphinx's tutelage. Both of them will cost you less than $10 or right around $10. And neither one of them use cards from Theros or M15. They'll last you right through the rotation. All pretty cool things. Let's go ahead and hit you. Well, the first deck we're going to do is blue-white tutelage control, and people just say, you know, we'll just make budget blue-white control and throw tutelage in there. Good idea, but what does budget blue-white control even look like, especially post-rotation? This deck gives us a little bit of a chance to find out. Now, we have to start off, of course, with 4 Sphinx's tutelage, and I think another given is 4 Monastery Siege in almost any tutelage deck, especially post-rotation. Once we lose cards like Dictate, it's pretty important for us. But gotta have Monastery Siege. Of course, we'll never use the one ability, but we'll always use the draw a card, discard a card ability. It's very, very good, accelerates us a lot. Card selection is important against pretty much everything in the format, so I think it is a given that we play that. And obviously, Sphinx's tutelage is the namesake of the deck. We're playing 4 copies. On to the counterspell suite. We're playing a total of 8 counterspells in the deck, 4 of which, because we don't know what's going to be in Battle for Zendikar, have to be cancel. A hard counter for just 3 mana, you know, that's pretty much where we want to be. And I wish that we could play Dissolve, I wish we could play even Dissipate, but so far we know that we're going to have cancel in the format, and that's as good as we can do right now, so we're playing it. We're also playing 2 Clash of Wills in the main deck, a pretty good card. We're playing a hefty amount of lands in the deck, and even into the late game we'll pretty much be able to make this a hard counter, but it's going to cost us a lot. And in the early game, it's a very, very good counter spell. Often just paying 2 or 3 mana into this will counter a spell in the first few turns, and that's pretty important for us. You know, the early game we have to make it through, and this is a really good early game counter spell. We're also playing 1 Negate against, you know, control decks, and even aggro. You know, red aggro, the most popular deck in the format that's won 2 Pro Tours in a row, for God's sake. That plays a ton of removal. I mean an absolute ton of removal. You know, Wild Splash, Lightning Strike, Stoke the Flames, you name it, Fiery Impulse, sometimes Roast in the main. So Negate, a very important card. Also 1 copy to finish off the counter spells of Disdainful Stroke. We are, if we can make it into a, you know, 5th, 6th, 7th turn, we usually do just fine, but against, you know, things like Green-Red Devotion, they're still dropping these like huge threats, and just 1 copy in the main deck of Disdainful Stroke helps mitigate some of the damage from things like that. You know, we really need to keep just huge bomby things from hitting the board. And again, even against things like aggro, this will counter or Stoke the Flames. So Disdainful Stroke is a pretty important card, I think. And those are our 8 counter spells. We are also playing some removal in this deck, because that's super important. You know, in the sort of Turbo Fog green-blue thing, we just mostly play a lot of spells that negate their entire combat step. We don't really have the luxury of doing that in this deck. We have to actually remove creatures. So what are the best sort of white removal things that we'll have after the rotation? Well, here's what removal we do have. 2 copies of Swift Reckoning. We're playing an awful lot of instants and sorceries in the deck. They'll be able to fill our graveyard fairly quickly, and Swift Reckoning is an all-star in the removal category. It just removes everything that we care about, except for Stormbreath Dragon, but that's only going to be around for another 6 weeks, so whatever. Swift Reckoning is really good even when you don't have the mastery on it, but you don't have to worry about that very often, especially after, you know, 4th, 5th turn, you will have it, so yes. Also playing, we're two copies of Celestial Flare. Celestial Flare, very, very good. We will get the 2 white most of the time. We're playing a hefty amount of white sources, mostly so we can get to End Hostilities, this card, by the 5th turn, because we absolutely have to get there. If we can just get on the other side of an End Hostilities, we increase our chance of winning the game tenfold if we can just make it to an End Hostilities. Now, there are plenty of ways to recover from an End Hostilities in the format, but we're not worried about that. We're just worried about wiping the board at least the 1 time and resetting the board state for just a moment and giving us some breathing room. So we have to play at least these 3 copies of End Hostilities. I'd be down for 4 too, but I just am not totally sold. I want to play more, you know, lower range removal and enough counter spells to keep things off the board in the first place. So went with 3 End Hostilities main deck, and that's our 7 removal cards right there. As far as the other spells that we're playing, we are playing 3 copies of Hydrolash, which is kind of like removal. This will negate a combat step or most of the damage from a combat step against a lot of decks, and draws you a card. It'll never be dead in your hand. You can just cycle this if you need to and activate Sphinx's tutelage. So I think this is better than some of the things we could play. This made it into the deck over Send to Sleep, although notably Send to Sleep was in the deck for most of its development cycle. Just got taken out for for a couple of other things, namely Disdainful Stroke in the main, and another Celestial Flare, which I felt like that was important. But Hydrolash is still a good card, even against stuff that we don't need to play it against, because it will always, at the very least, cycle. And, at the very most, it'll just, hose their whole team for, like, new Jace's +1, which is pretty good. So I do like Hydrolash at the end of the day. A little bit more than Send to Sleep, but I can understand if you wanted to play that. We're playing one copy of Ojutai's Command, which is pretty much all of the money in the deck right there. I mean, if you have more money or more copies of Command, definitely play it up. Command is an all-star. You're going to use all the modes on it. It helps you stabilize your life, draw that card for the advantage, and, obviously activates Tutelage. You're going to use that mode kind of a lot too. So just everything the card does is very, very good, and if you have more copies, totally play them because they're very important. Also, 3 copies of Treasure Cruise, another very important card in the deck. Oftentimes, too, you're not that worried about overpaying for this, it turns out, but you will play it for just the 1, sometimes 2 mana very, very often as well. And this is at least 6 cards milled with Sphinx's Tutelage, sometimes more than that, very often more than that against some decks. And gotta have it. 3 cards for us and a bunch of cards off the top of their library is exactly what we want to do. So let's do it. So we're playing 2 copies of Dragonlord's Prerogative because it's awesome. A mill of at least 8 if you've got a Sphinx's Tutelage out. And just 4 cards at instant speed is awesome all the time. Drawing into more removal, drawing into more counter spells, all good. Drawing into a second copy of Sphinx's Tutelage is pretty sweet too. Even a second Monastery Siege. I mean, 4 cards is an awful lot of cards. And this only gets better when you have Tutelage out. A couple of Tutelages is also pretty effing sweet. So, really want to play at least these 2 copies of Prerogative. At instant speed especially, this is a very nice card. And 2 copies of Fascination in the main deck. This is our finishing blow, and it works especially well in a budget blue deck. Something with Sphinx's Tutelage. Because we really can't play expensive cards in the deck, and it's a Fascination. And I'm not saying Tutelage is an expensive deck to begin with, but Fascination I think is a pretty good budget option to finish the game out. And remember that the active player draws all their cards first, in a situation where both players draw cards. So you'll draw all your cards, all those Sphinx's activations, those triggers will happen, and then they'll draw their cards out. It's pretty cool too because, just in case you haven't milled them out with all those Tutelage triggers, they still have to draw all of their cards. And this is interesting too because sometimes they won't be able to make it to that next upkeep to where they can untap and play their Lightning Strike before they have to draw the non-existent card that loses in the game. They don't get the luxury of having an untap and upkeep step in this situation. They have to immediately mill, immediately draw their cards, and very likely mill out if you Fascination in the late game for like 5. Just pay 7 mana, Fascination for 5. That'll mill at least 10 cards, very often like 16 to 18 cards, and you will win the game. Fascination is actually super, super good a lot of the time. Here are the lands. We're playing 26 of them. Playing those tap lands and those Radiant Fountains is especially important. We have to stabilize our life total because we have to survive the early game. And Ojutai's Command ain't going to just do it by itself. We have to have other things, and these are great. Also, the Evolving Wilds, make a quick note about that. That is in there mostly to fuel the Treasure Cruise and make sure you get your white sources for End Hostilities and Celestial Flare, but mostly End Hostilities. And fueling Treasure Cruise is super important. Here's the board real quick. This is, first of all, Surge of Righteousness almost made the main deck. The card is very good. Again, helps to stabilize our life total. We'll almost always find a target, whether it's Siege Rhino, Abbot of Carol Keep, any red creature. This is especially good against, Monastery Swift Spear early game. I really, really like Surge of Righteousness, and it could have made it in the main deck. I could say the same thing about Encase and Ice. I wanted to play Silk Wrap, for instance, but those just didn't have all the synergy that I wanted them to have with Swift Reckoning, which is a very powerful card, regardless of whether it has Mastery, but just becomes way better if it does have Mastery. So, I wanted to have as much synergy with those as possible, didn't play so many main deck enchantments, especially considering we're already playing 8 main deck enchantments. We don't have all the slots for that nonsense. So, but I can understand if you wanted to play Silk Wrap main deck. I would get that. Here's the power rankings real quickly before I move on to the other deck. A grand score, final score of 48, which is, fairly low, but again, this is a budget deck. It's mostly fun, but there are times where Sphinx's Tutelage just goes off the rails and mills a billion cards, all in just a few activations. I mean, there are times where you don't hit a land, and they're playing mono red. So you just, 2 activations of Tutelage, 2 triggers of Tutelage, and you're just milling like 12 to 14 cards. Totally happens a lot. And it just wins out of nowhere a lot of the time. I mean, it's a clock in a lot of ways. And it is traditional blue-white control, and like I said, the big part about this deck is getting on the other end of an End Hostilities. If we can just get to the other side of an End Hostilities, clear the board once, then we have a very, very much higher chance of winning the game. Now, that was a control deck. Let's move on to an aggro deck, sort of-ish, yeah, aggro-y. I call it Tutelaggro, which is a dumb name, but it's kind of funny, at least to me. This deck actually plays creatures and has Sphinx's Tutelage. Imagine that. You don't see that every day. First, let's do the creatures first, actually. I'm really excited about this. You don't see this kind of deck every day. I think it's a new perspective, at least. Toot my own horn for a second. But anyway, here's what we're doing. We're playing 16 creatures in the deck, 4 copies of Jeskai Sage to start things off, a pretty important card. The prowess is really, really good on the card, and obviously when it dies, it triggers Sphinx's Tutelage and replaces itself, which is really, really good. We're playing 4 copies of Jeskai Elder and 4 copies of Jeshian Thief. I put them up at the same time because and we're, you know, they do virtually the same thing, very similar things at least. Creatures that hit for draw a card are awesome. I mean, not only do they do their damage, not only do they both have prowess, but they will activate Sphinx's Tutelage, which is really good. Now, we're not just looking to mill them out all the time with Sphinx's Tutelage either. This also mills through removal and stuff like that they're looking to get, you know. All the burn, Hero's Downfall, Languish, you know, any sort of thing that they can get to remove our dudes and help stabilize in some mid-range and control decks. We can just mill that right out of their library, take that chance away from them. So that's pretty cool. That's desirable for an aggro deck. We're also playing 2 copies of Zephyr Scribe here. Zephyr Scribe is a super important card, it turns out. Zephyr Scribe, I want there really to be more copies of this, and I could see that. But really consistent. Not only does it, you know, great card selection, very good card selection. We can often untap it more than just the one time in a turn, especially later on in the game. But every activation, again, triggers Sphinx's Tutelage. I mean, we can more effectively do it once a turn. And this is sort of like another Monastery Siege for us. Very good card, it turns out. And finally, with the creatures, I wanted to slip this in at the end. I could have just put it in with Jeskai Sage, but we're also doing 2 copies of Palace Familiar in the deck. It just doesn't have prowess, so I didn't put it with the other creatures. But in any case, a lot like Jeskai Sage, functions as a very early game, you know, blocker, which is really good, trades with a Thopter for what it's worth, but also blocks big flyers, which is cool. We need to make it to the late game. This helps us do that. Replaces itself when it does die. You'll see that all the creatures in the deck draw us cards some way or another. And triggers Sphinx's Tutelage, so I do want to play at least the 2 copies of Familiar. I didn't play Fairy Miscreants. There was a playset in here for most of the development cycle, but ended up just not really being what I wanted it to be. It's a good early game blocker, yes, but you often don't draw the card off of it, you know? It's few and far between, or too few for me at least, to draw the card, and even fewer and farther to draw to trigger Sphinx's Tutelage. I really want Sphinx's Revelation back. That would just be amazing. A lot of players would hate that though, right? But anyway, Fairy Miscreants just wasn't exactly where I wanted to be in the deck, so I just increased the copies of Thief and Elder, which are just all-stars in this thing. We are playing 4 copies of Sphinx's Tutelage and 4 copies of Monastery Siege, you know, the same thing. I think that those both are a given in the deck, and we might even use the other thing on Monastery Siege in this deck. It's even more versatile in this thing, so I do want to play the 4 copies again of said card. As far as the regular spells, the other spells in the deck, we're playing 4 copies of Disperse, sort of the only real removal available to us, you know. Disperse is really good in that it can hit things other than creatures, that's cool, and can clear the board so that we can just draw cards, and sort of works as a tempo card for us, which is really, really good. And it's the only actual removal we can play in this like mono blue deck, besides like Force Away, but Force Away doesn't actually work half the time. Our creatures don't get to 4 power like hardly ever, even when they do prowess, so I didn't really want to play Force Away. We're also playing 2 Send to Sleep, another sort of removal element. This is really, really good in this deck too. You know, we're playing an awful lot of instants or sorceries. Notice we're playing Send to Sleep instead of Hydrolash in this deck because it just makes so much more sense in this deck. You know, we can negate 2 of their attack steps with their biggest creatures, sometimes their only creatures, and get our dudes through not only for damage and prowess damage on top of that, but also to draw cards whether we're triggering Tutelage or not. not. It's still good, you know. Draw us into more dudes that'll draw cards when they hit, or draw us into removal, or draw us into treasure cruise, whatever, or another Sphinx's Tutelage. 2 on the board is just dope. It's freaking ridiculous. So, you know, I do think that, you know, we do want to play Send to Sleep in this deck, absolutely. We're also playing 4 copies of Stratus Walk in the deck now. 2 of the creatures fly, sure, Palace familiar, but doesn't matter. I mean, if we can put this on, say, a Jeshian Thief or an Elder, blah, blah, you know, it doesn't win us the game outright or anything, but it does draw us a card replacing itself in our hands. Triggers Sphinx's Tutelage if you have that out, and makes those creatures tougher to block so that you can draw even more cards. I don't see any reason not to play Stratus Walk. It was recently reprinted, and I rejoiced. So, do want to play the Walk in this deck. And to finish it off, we're playing 2 Treasure Cruise in the main deck here. Treasure Cruise, draw 3 cards, a lot of time for 1 mana. I mean, this is the only thing in the deck that we need to, you know, this isn't the kind of thing where we have like Swift Reckoning like the last deck and we have to sort of worry about it being at odds with Treasure Cruise. No, we can just cruise away in this deck and not have to worry about it, you know. Just get rid of all the cards in our graveyard, we do not care about them, and cruise for 1, you know. 3 cards is very, very good. Again, regardless of whether we're triggering Tutelage or not, we can just play more creatures off of it. I do like the card one way or the other. I mean, 3 cards for 1 90% of the time. Let's play Treasure Cruise. Here are the lands very quickly. We do want to play Radiant Fountains, and since we're not playing any 1-drops, I could totally understand playing some sort of 2-mana tap land just to make sure your life stays high for most of the game, because it's very important, especially against these super aggressive decks that we see in the format. And here's the board. You know what's really good in this board? Sidisi's Faithful, especially considering we're playing Jeskai Sage and Palace Familiar in the deck, both of which exploit super well to Sidisi's Faithful, and then we can just like clog up the board with a 0/4 butt and block, you know, aggro creatures. So Sidisi's Faithful comes in a lot from the sideboard and interacts well with some of the stuff we're already playing in the main deck. And here are the power rankings. Final score of 47, just 1 point behind its blue-white brother. Yeah, both of these are below 50. I understand that, but at least this deck too, I think it's a good jumping off point, especially post-rotation, depending on what we get. I mean, this is an interesting idea, at least. I had a whole lot of fun testing this deck, and it has won some games, but didn't do, you know, the best against some of the heavy hitters in the format, but I wouldn't expect it to. I mean, Cuneo built the blue-red Turbo Mill deck, and that thing is a beast, and it just really couldn't survive Pro Tour Magic Origins at all. So something like this, a budget blue-white deck up against, you know, Pro Tour champion red aggro, it has a lot of problems that it has to overcome. It's playing in hard mode, but it can be done. I did pick up a game against red aggro in testing, so take that how you will. I think that it can win, especially because, considering the second deck clogs up the board pretty well. But in any case, those are my 2 decks for Sphinx's Tutelage, at least for now. I'm sure I'll put out more Tutelage decks in the future because I love the card. I finally got to play with it in testing for these 2 decks, and I'm really impressed with it. A lot of the times, especially I think in the format we're moving into, it will hit multicolored cards, or, you know, cards that share a color, excuse me, very, very often. So, and there are times where you expect just to, you know, off of Treasure Cruise, I'm going to mill, you know, 6 or 8. You end up milling 16 or 18. It happens kind of more than you would ever expect. You just don't hit the land, or you don't hit 2 cards that don't share a color. It just happens kind of a lot, and is awesome. So, that's my take on it. Let me know what you think and what you'd like to see next. Here's what I'm definitely doing next, and why I sort of went ahead and did Tutelage first and didn't do Alesha yet, because I need your help with Alesha. I need all of your help with Alesha. I have currently 3 ideas on the table for Alesha. I want to know which one you like the most. We can either do Mardu Alesha, just a very focused, concentrated sort of almost Mardu Warriors deck, but not quite Warriors focused. You know, it's got then Tuco Husk in it, and you can take advantage of a few different things. But pretty focused Mardu deck with Alesha and mostly creatures. Or I can do Jund Alesha with Collected Company, mostly just to take advantage of the power of that 1 card. Or even on top of that, I can do 4-color Alesha that plays Collected Company and no other green cards. Perhaps Dim Protector, but not really what you want to hit with Alesha, you know what I mean? Or Collected Company for that matter. This really doesn't have the best synergy with either of those cards. So I was thinking 4-color Alesha with just Collected Company as your only green card. But let me know how you feel about those 3 decks, and I will put out one of them before, you know, a few days is up. I'm testing with a couple of different versions of the deck, but I want Alesha to be competitive, and so far I think the Mardu deck is probably the most competitive one. Although I don't want to downplay the power of Collected Company. The card is very, very good. But in any case, that's how I feel. If you enjoyed the content, like, share, comment, subscribe. Sharing does us so much help. Like helps us with the YouTube algorithm. And commenting lets us know how you feel, which is actually super important to us. Thanks for all the feedback lately. All the love is really appreciated. And yeah, we're going to just keep growing, and you guys are awesome. So I'll see you guys next time. I'm Deb from the SBMTG. Thanks for watching, my wizards.